Well, good morning. Welcome to Faith on Hill's online Sunday morning service. We gather together every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m., both online and in person. Of course, you are here with us on faithonhill.com watching the live stream, or you're at our YouTube, our Spotify, or our Apple podcast getting all of our online content. And if you don't have that, you can just search Faith on Hill Church and you can subscribe and follow and all of that stuff. You can follow us on social media at Faith on Hill. We are in person at 10:30 a.m. at our building on Hill Road in Oak Grove. We are a church here for Gladstone, Milwaukee, and Oak Grove, Oregon. And we are gathered for prayer, worship, the study of God's Word. We have kids' church and a middle school group that meets on Sundays. And then Thursday nights here at our building at 7 p.m., we have youth group for high school and for middle school at 7 p.m. We have small groups that meet throughout the week. Our Sunday morning small group has restarted. Our Wednesday night group is still on a little break, but our Tuesday night group will be starting back up next week as well. We had a little breaks going on. But you can email smallgroups at faithonhill.com for more information. We meet in person and online in our small groups, and we discuss questions that are based off of this Bible study. And so if you want more information, reach out. We'd love to connect with you. Now, we're going to be finishing Romans 12 today. We are going to talk about some things that just are inherently controversial. And I don't mean to be controversial, and I'm going to try not to be controversial. But if I say something and you're like, hey, mister, I think you're wrong about that, that's okay. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. Maybe I'm going to say something and you're like, did you really mean to say that? You can reach out. Adam@faithonhill.com is my email. And I would love to connect and dialogue with people. I'm going to say some things that I'm trying not to be controversial, but the subject matter might be. And so, that's just something landmines will have to walk through, all right? So we're going to finish Romans chapter 12 this morning. We left off in verse 9 last week. Romans chapter 12, verse 9 says, love must be sincere. There are two types of Bible translations. There are word-for-word translations, and then there are thought-for-thought translations. There are also paraphrases. Paraphrases are like the Message, things like that. They are not a direct translation, but they are just kind of paraphrasing what the Bible says. But a word-for-word translation, that's your King James, New American Standard, ESV, the English Standard Version. The word-for-word ones are trying as best they can to say exactly how it is said in the original Hebrew or Greek, depending on the book of the Bible. That's difficult, though. Sometimes it is really easy to translate certain parts of the Bible, and sometimes when rhetoric or idiom or, kind of a common, we would say something, like in England when I lived there, they might say, are you taking the mick out of me? And maybe you don't know what that means because you've never lived in England, right? Those are just kind of like common idioms or slang or whatever, and it gets hard to translate that. So, thought-for-thought translations say, what's the gist of what's being said? It's not like they're paraphrasing, but instead of trying to be word for word, they're just taking like a sentence or a verse or a few verses, and they're trying to give the thought of what's being said. That is your New Living Translation, your NIV, that kind of thing tends to be thought for thought. I teach out of the NIV. I personally often read out of the New Living Translation. Sometimes I read out of the New American Standard if I want a word-for-word translation. Sometimes I read out of the New King James if I just want a different perspective. Sometimes, because I'm just weird, I guess, I read out of the Old King James. By the way, I think just about every translation you've ever come across is probably okay. Every so often you'll see these articles or posts online about some translation of the Bible and it's evil or wrong or satanic or something. And yeah, there are some bad translations out there, but they're not the ones that people have, right? Most people have a King James, a New King James, a New International Version, a New Living Translation. Those are the ones most people have. ESV and NASB are also common. I'm not worried about any of those translations. Even the Message is fine. It's not something I would base your theology off of, but it's pretty good, by the way. And so I would say, those are all fine. what's interesting to me is when you do read different translations, and it's easier than ever to do it, the Bible app, Bible.com, BibleGateway.com, so on and so on, like all these different websites and apps that we can get for free and compare. And I was reading chapter 12 in a few different versions. What was interesting to me is that New International Version says, love must be sincere. New Living Version says this: don't just pretend to love, really love. Don't just pretend to love, actually love. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Love and hate are central themes in a conversation or an argument, depending on who you are and where you've been, that have been going on between the church and the culture and within the church itself for the last several decades. Love and hate. How do I love somebody? And you'll hear the pithy little isms, love the sinner, hate the sin. But, if we're honest, some people just seem to love the sinner and not care about the sin, and others just seem to hate the sinner and call it hating the sin, but they're just hateful people. How do you find that balance? I like that New Living Translation way of saying it. Don't just pretend to love, actually love them, really love. Every person that you meet, every person that I meet, every person that walks down your street or lives around you or lives in another part of the country or another part of the world, the people here in America, the people in Iran, the people who are rich, the people who are poor, the West Coast to the East Coast, the middle heartland of the country, the North, the South, Western Oregon, Eastern Oregon, any divide that you can think of, the people who live in Israel, the people who live in Gaza, every person is important and valuable. How do I know this? Because they are so important and so valuable that Jesus died to save them. Jesus died so that that person would have the opportunity to have their sins forgiven. That the people who are other than us could have a chance at new life. That means every person that you meet or I meet is valuable, is important, is loved by God. God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And if that is how God feels about people, how can we feel any less? Every person who walks through our church doors, every person we meet in our community, every person that we interact with should know that they are loved and valuable and safe and cared for. That is my first stop. That's point A. That's where I go. Somebody says, well, how do you deal with this thing or that person? Do they know that they are loved? Do they know that we have care and concern for them as people? If the first thing that we do is label people, we dehumanize them. If the first thing that we do is label somebody as woke or MAGA, if the first thing that we do is label somebody as legal or illegal, if the first thing that we do is label somebody as old or young, rich or poor, if the first thing that we do is put a label on them, we dehumanize them because we are putting something other than human upon them. We are saying, hey, this person is something other than loved by God. Now, I can hear the objection. Well, what about the people who say we can't be colorblind anymore, that we have to put labels on things? I'm not talking about that. I'm not saying I don't see people. I don't recognize where people are coming from. Like, let's be honest about things. I know when somebody looks like me. I know when somebody doesn't look like me. I know when there are certain tells and all that, and I'm not going to pretend that that's not there. I know when somebody's older than me or younger than me. I know when somebody is other than me, right? It's there. But the first thing that should be in my heart, in my mind, in my conversation, in my action towards somebody is You are loved and you are valuable. And God cares about you, and so do I, and so do we. That's the first step. Love must be sincere. Then I can hate what is evil. And we should. We can do both. I believe two things can be true at once. I believe that we can love and be loving towards every single person that we know, that we meet, that we interact with, and we can hate what is evil, right? We can. I believe that is possible. I don't believe it would be in the Bible if it wasn't. I believe we can say, look, this is what God has said is evil, and that thing is not something that we want to endorse or condone or anything. But we got to love people. One of the questions that gets brought up is, why don't you preach against this sin or that sin or whatever? Why don't you preach against this or that? Because it's not my story to tell. And maybe this is a cop-out. I don't know. If you feel like it is, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to. But here's the truth. If we have, a room full of people, right? And 95% of them are dealing with one type of sin, but there is a segment of the population, 5%, that's dealing with a different type of sin. And it seems like people only want me to preach against that 5% of the sin. There's an imbalance there. The reality is, I'll give you an example. I'm going to speak real world. When I came to this church, when I started pastoring here, there were several people who were openly engaged in things that the Bible calls sinful. One person was engaged in a type of action that everybody's like, oh, but a bunch of other people over here were engaged in a different kind of sin. Why is it that those people don't get the same attention? That seems wrong to me. I think we can say we hold to what the Bible calls good, what the Bible calls right. We need to put our lives towards that. I want to go where Jesus is going. And at the same time, does a person feel loved and safe and cared for? When the woman caught in adultery was brought before Jesus, did he throw stones at her? No. He showed care for her, treated her with respect and dignity as a human being. And then he said, go and sin no more. We can love one another. It says to be devoted to one another in love. I think that is a question it is worth asking. Several years ago, we were having a debate, a theological debate in our group of churches. We're part of the Pacific Conference here in Washington and Oregon. And we're having a theological debate, and somebody got up and said, we have to stand for biblical truth. And of course, that meant biblical truth as they saw it. And there was some more arguments. And then a few minutes later, somebody else stood up and said, there was a brother that just said we need to stand for biblical truth. And he said, I agree. And he said, unity and love amongst Christians is a biblical truth. And we have to stand for that too. And it gave me pause to think, because I had my opinion, I had my side of the debate. But if I am standing for my side of the debate without also standing for love and devotion to each other in love, then I'm off base. Honor one another above yourself. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. These verses and others that we're going to read have been used to kind of put burdens on people. And that's not what I'm interested in doing. These are affirmations. And I want to be careful about saying affirmations because it makes it sound like the Bible's optional. But these are things that Paul's saying, hey, this is a general orientation of your life, however that looks. Because the extroverts love to put this kind of stuff on the introverts, be full of hope and zeal and hospitable, get out there, invite people to your homes. And the introverts are going, no, I do not want that. I am going to curl up in a ball and hide. As the Lord leads you, live in these things. It says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. That's challenging. Now, 6 years ago, the world shut down. And there are Christians and churches in this area and all over our country and all over the world, but, let's just stick to where we're at, who genuinely believed that during that time they were persecuted by the government and the culture during COVID, that they were persecuted by restrictions on how many people could gather and meet. They were persecuted by mask requirements and so on and so on. I'm not interested in rehashing that whole debate. I think that, look, that's been gone over. Here's my thought, though. It says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. If you are a Christian who believes that during that season, you, us, we, the church, were experiencing persecution, did we live in this verse? If we're going to stand for biblical truth, did we live in the verse that says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse? There are Christians who believe that the government, the culture, whatever, the school district, the media, whatever, is out to get them. Do we live in this verse? Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. If we say we're going to stand for biblical values, if we say we're going to stand for biblical truth, if we say we are going to stand firm on the word of God and what God has spoken, we will say amen, then how do we live in this? Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Certainly there were inconsistencies during that time, and certainly I think there probably were places where some people were used to persecute the church or persecute Christians individually. I'm not saying that didn't happen anywhere, but I'm asking this: if that was happening to you or to us or to a collective or to a specific church, if that was happening, how did we live? How did we live? Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Know the season you're in. Read the room. You know, there are times where it's a time for rejoicing. It's okay to celebrate. It's okay to rejoice. There are also moments where we got to pause. We have to stop. We have to mourn. Read the room. Know which season you're in, if possible. Verse 16 says, live in harmony with one another. Sometimes that means I have to give up something I want. Live in harmony with one another. Sometimes that means that we just, hey, what's a compromise we can come to? I don't mean compromise in like a bad sense, but like what's a way that we can find some common ground, or we can just say, you know what, I'm not going to make that the thing that's not going to be the hill I die on. Do not be proud, but willing to associate with people of a low position. Look, let's be honest. Some Christians live this way. They will choose to go, I don't know. It's like, I want to say something. Bear with me on this. I want to say something, but I feel like if I do, somebody in this neighborhood is going to feel like I'm talking about them. So can we agree that I am, honest to goodness, not talking about anyone specific? Can we agree on that? Thank you. But I do believe there are people who leave this community, this neighborhood, because they want to go to church with rich people. And I can think of specific churches. There are specific churches I'm thinking of. I'm honest to goodness not thinking of any specific person, but I am honest to goodness thinking of the churches they go to. And you go to the rich white church in one of the rich white suburbs. And I'm not saying white as like I'm being anti-white or some kind of like racial thing, but let's be honest about it, right? We know that there's a difference between a white church and a Korean church, between a white church and a black church, between a white church and a Hispanic church. And if you've never been to a Korean church or a Hispanic church or a Russian church, or you know, if you've been to a church from an ethnic flavor or tradition, you know there is a difference, right? There is an absolute difference between a Hispanic church service and a white church service. There just is. Not just the language, but just the flavor and the feel and the energy and all of that. So, and my goodness, if you've never been to it, there's a difference between like an American black church and an African church. Like they are also different things. So I'm saying like there is a lot going on. I've been to church services for all these different types of flavors and traditions and backgrounds and groups and expressions and all that. I think there are people that don't want to go to church with people who have issues, people who have needs, people who have, you know, they're not easy to deal with. I remember there was a gal who started coming to the church that I went to, and I was in college and part of this college group, and she had some pretty significant mental health issues. And I'm not proud. I'm not proud of how my group of friends and my peers and myself, and even I would say some of our church leaders, I'm not proud of how we handled it. I think we didn't do well by that woman. And it's something I think about a lot because I'm not proud of it, but also how can we do better? How can we associate with everyone? Do not repay evil for evil. That is tempting, by the way. There are people that if I could repay them evil for the evil they've done me, it would be hard for me to say no. There are absolutely people who have done evil to me. I mean, you could probably say the same thing. All I would say is this. I one time was praying a prayer against somebody who had done evil to me, or so I felt. I felt like this person had done harm to me, and I was angry, and I was praying against them. Lord, smite them. I was using the Old Testament, old-timey words, because it was like, if we get those words in play, maybe God will take my prayer more seriously. It's a silly thought, but I was. And it's one of the handful of times, in fact, I would say it's one of two specific times in my life where I've come close to hearing a voice from God. And it was God saying to me this: do you want me to answer the prayers of people who have prayed that against you? I basically felt God say to me, Adam, I can answer your prayer against this person, but what about people who have prayed that against you? Do you want me to answer their prayers? And I don't know if anybody has ever prayed, Lord, smite Adam, but it got my attention. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. This is just a good word to go by. You know, over the years, we've had beefs, right? All of us have. When we lived in California, we lived in these condos, and there was an older retired person who lived 2 condos down, and they didn't like the noise my kids made. Kids would play in the little backyard area, and they didn't like it. And there was another family who lived in the condo across the way, and they didn't like their kids being kids either. And so we had some beef, right? Like there were issues that we had to deal with. That's not fun. If it is possible, I'm not talking about codependency or toxicity or unhealthy, emotionally, spiritually unhealthy situations. Remember I said earlier that there have been people who have used this to put other people down. Oh, you can't speak up for what's true or right or defend yourself. You have to live at peace with all people. I'm not talking about that. There have been times where we've had to speak the truth. A couple of years ago. In fact, from where I'm filming, I can see the house. There were 2 neighbors who really did not like Faith on Hill Church, and they didn't like what was going on here, and they had some real beef with us. And, we, as loving as we could be, but also firm, like, hey, this is not okay. I had a neighbor, he no longer lives in the area, but he moved, but he was just saying horrible things about us, and he sent me this really nasty email, and I could have just rolled over, but I, as politely as I could, I responded, and I said, look, what you're saying is not true, but I hope we can be at peace and work it out. That's our heart, our goal. It doesn't mean that we roll over for people, that we're pushovers. In fact, this surprises people sometimes because I've had people try to get, the church, they're softies, they'll just roll over. No, we're not going to do that. We're not just going to roll over for you, but we're also not trying to be unpeaceful towards people. Do not take revenge. Again, this is this whole thing about don't repay evil for evil. My dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. So Paul's saying, look, if you go to the Old Testament says this. God said, everybody's like, oh, an eye for an eye. That's what it says in the Old Testament. But actually, God was the one who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Vengeance isn't our business. And on the contrary, Paul says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Paul's saying, hey, more than just don't try to get revenge, more than just don't try to take it out on somebody else. Let God be on that. On top of that, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If your enemy is thirsty, give him a drink. Again, I am not talking about unhealthy situations. I'm not talking about just rolling over. I have seen this. Churches where leadership is spiritually abusive, or there is a situation where a spouse is being emotionally or spiritually or physically abusive to the other spouse. And people have said, oh, you know what? It's not yours to deal with this. Live at peace. Just kind of roll over, take it. This is just what it is. That's not what we're talking about. If you are unsafe, get to a place of safety. If somebody is harming you, get away from that dangerous situation. Paul was about to be flogged by the Romans in Jerusalem, and he said, hey, is it lawful for you to flog a Roman citizen? Meaning, he wasn't going to take the beating if he didn't have to. There were times where Paul was physically abused and beaten for his Christian faith. But if he didn't have to take it, why take it? Paul's not saying that, but he is saying, hey, the gospel is if your enemy is hungry, feed him, because that's the gospel, that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Here's a way this looks like. King David, he wasn't King David yet, he was just David. And David was on the run because the guy who was the king, Saul, was trying to kill him. And then Saul is chasing David all over the countryside, and David gets the drop on him, and David could kill him. He could. But he doesn't. In fact, the people that are with him are like, David, come on. You just, run Saul through with your sword right here. He won't even see you coming. And it'll all be over. David says, no, I am not going to do that. That's the Lord's business. So then David gets a safe distance away. Saul can't get him. He's up on this big cliff or ravine or hill or something. And he says to Saul, hey, Saul. And Saul's like, oh, is that you? And he yells back at him, yeah, it's me. And he has this conversation like, Saul, you're chasing me, but I could have killed you here, and I could have gotten you here, but I didn't. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to live at peace with you. So you can see David, he is not right there in a dangerous situation. He's not letting his abuser, his tormentor get to him, but he's also stepping back and trying to live at peace. And he won't take vengeance because it's not his to take. And he does good if he can to those who are doing evil to him. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. We are not going to help change this culture or this climate or the world or this community or whatever by adding to the evil. We don't add. There's this whole thing about fighting fire with fire. And I was watching one of the hot ones, that show on YouTube about where the celebrities eat the spicy chicken wings and there's an interview. And I was watching one recently and the guy said, the celebrity's like, I have a lot of family members who are fighters and they've never said fight fire with fire, right? Adding to the hate, adding to the yelling, adding to the acrimony, it does nothing. It does not help. Love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to good. We can stand and cling to what is good. We can continue to say, Lord, lead us in these ways that you have for us. At the beginning of chapter 12, what did Paul say? He says, do not conform yourself to the patterns of this world. And then you read verses 9 through the end of the chapter, and you see how this is not how the world operates. The world is full of hate. The world is full of backbiting and attacking and division. And if somebody persecutes you, get them back. If somebody is down, whatever, live in harmony with all people. No, man, that's just hippie nonsense. We're going to stand firm and we're going to oppose the enemy and all this stuff. We can stand in the love of God. We won't be overcome by evil if we can stand in the good that God has for us. While we were his enemies, Christ died to save us. And in the same way, as we stand firm in the love of God, you matter, and you matter, and you matter, and every person that we interact with, that we that God brings into our path, every person that comes across our lives should know and can know that they are loved and that they are important and that they are valuable. Do we compromise anything God has said? No. Somebody asked a pastor once, I want to come to church. I want to come to church, but I don't know if I'll be welcomed and I don't know if I'll feel safe. And the pastor said two things. He said, everyone is welcomed here. But I hope none of us feel safe. I hope I don't feel safe. I hope you don't feel safe. Because if we feel safe, then we think that God doesn't have anything he needs to shake up in our lives. I want everyone to feel loved and welcomed, but do I want myself or any of us to feel safe? No, because God has work to do in all of us so that he can do work through all of us. God bless you. If there was anything you had questions about, if you're like, hey, wait a minute, mister, you said this. I don't like that. That's fine. Adam@faithonhill.com is my email. Whatever it is that came up that used to be, you're like, hey, wait, what about this? What about this? Let's talk about it. We'll be talking about it this week in the small groups as we meet together and we continue studying the book of Romans together. All right. God bless you. We'll see you next week.